A reading from Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 37. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman, whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, immediately heard about him. She came and bowed down at his feet. Now this woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home, found the child lying on the bed, the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The encounter between Jesus and the Syro-Phoenician woman has lived in my head rent-free for well over a decade. I haven't been able to shake it since I ran headlong into it in my first year of seminary. That year, I took a series of classes on urban ministry as part of my work at a homeless shelter. The reflection class from my crew of shelter-working seminarians met once a week in the upstairs of the chapel building. As part of our coursework, we read Howard Thurman's amazing text, Jesus and the Disinherited, where he devotes a fair amount of space to this story. Discussing it, my friend and colleague Brian, who went on to do PhD work, used the phrase, "the sinfulness of Christ," to which our professor, who was perhaps less free-willing and more traditional than Brian, said, "Brian, we don't believe in that." Our professor spoke correctly. From Paul on down, Christianity stakes a firm commitment to a sinless and perfect Jesus. His lack of faults holds the whole theological system together. Cool. So what do we do with this scene where Jesus compares a woman to a dog and to our 21st century ears sounds more than a little prejudiced? Thurman uses it as an opportunity to deeply ponder the nature of a profoundly embedded discriminatory social system, and Jesus goes on to extend the healing and power of God to this person usually considered far beyond the definition of God's people. Still, I find the dialogue jarring. Reading it again from Mark chapter 7, verses 27 and 28. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with and pastor many first responders, sailors, soldiers, and correctional officers. I particularly enjoy the way that they talk to each other when they think that they're only in the presence of people who have seen the darker side of the world. In all of those professions, they regularly encounter and have to participate in deeply traumatizing things. The nature of the job sends them routinely wading into situations that the vast majority of the population could not imagine. War movies, cop shows, medical dramas, and reality TV prison exposés don't begin to capture the experience. They process never-ending streams of horrors by telling competitive stories of how bad they had it, teasing each other, and concocting truly dark jokes about what they go through. To an outsider, it feels off-putting. How can they talk so casually about violence and death? What's wrong with them? It's why they only tend to talk to other folks who know that end of the world. They don't want your shock or pity. They just want to communicate the extreme nature of their lives in a way that feels safe. Thus, you get an endless stream of, "so this one time," followed by deeply guttural laughing. As a kid living in Belgium, I got a thrill every time that I heard an American accent in public. At home, school, and church, I had plenty of Americans in my life. Antwerp International School had students from around the world, but at least a third of my fellow students hailed from the good old US of A. However, whenever we stepped out beyond this narrow community of a few hundred expats, the background dialogue of the world became incomprehensible, and to my elementary school mind, intimidating. I remember the Belgians being nice, but it all reminded me of how far that I was from home. So when I heard that specific sound that only Americans make float into my ears in a restaurant, museum, walking street, or toy store, I felt a point of connection, of shared experience. When the broader world around you doesn't share your experience, you find ways to cling to the people who do. Minority communities and oppressed people around the world have had their own versions of this since the dawn of time. All communities form their own codes of conduct, and often, when your code of conduct doesn't match the ambient culture, you code switch to match and blend in. However, when you find someone in a culture with a different code who has the same code as you immediately have a powerful point of connection. Maybe they came from the same culture, language, country, or ethnic group. Or like soldiers, sailors, first responders, correctional officers, cancer survivors, or new mothers, maybe they have the same life and perspective-altering experience. I wonder if this captures the relationship between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. They come from different ethnic groups and most likely communicated in their second language. Generally speaking, Syrophoenicia had greater wealth than Galilee and Judea, so the semi-homeless traveling rabbi son of a carpenter probably had a different lifestyle than his interlocutor. However, both of them would have experienced rejection from the mainstream leadership of God's people. Jesus constantly brushes off attacks from Pharisees, Sadducees, and temple leaders. He knows that they'll kill him one day. The Syrophoenician woman has clearly received the message that, despite an inkling of the reality of God, she does not belong within the faithful. She has some faith, but comes from the wrong place. I admit that I'm out on a limb here. The text says none of this. Still, perhaps, Jesus and the woman are telling each other a dark joke, in the same vein as first responders, soldiers, sailors, and correctional officers tell jokes about their trauma. Jesus calls her a dog, not as an insult, but with a wink and a nod to knowing what it feels like for God's people to treat him as less than. She responds smiling, knowing the feeling with a quip about getting the crumbs. Jesus does the requested healing, and they both walk away feeling warmed by an encounter with another who truly knows what it's like. From the outside, how they talk to each other appears weird and mean, but maybe, from the inside, they felt comfort and a safe way to process what keeps happening to them at the hands of God's people.